we're going to record it. We're going to record only the presentation, not the questions that you ask, just so you know. Put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that the presenters get to answer them at the end of the presentation. And I think that's the main thing that you need to hear, except welcome to everyone. And I'm pleased to present a couple of the founders, actually, of the League Committee, which is working on abolishing the Electoral College. They had started that work in 2017. It became more critical in 2022 when then LWV president, Deborah Turner, I always say her name wrong. Anyway, when she put that as a very important goal for the league moving forward. So this committee, which is headed by Rosemary, Heilemann, and Joyce Williams, who you can see on the screen, they are working closely with the U.S. League and other leagues around the country to make progress on abolishing the Electoral College by amending the U.S. Constitution. So that is something the league wants, and we're here to give you some more information about how that goes. So welcome, everyone. And Rosemary, do I turn it over to you or what? Your mic's off.
Joyce is going to do the first half, and then I'll give her a break and finish up.
Okay, well then Joyce,
you're going to run the slideshow, Rosemary?
Yep.
Okay, great.
We We're good. Thank you.
Okay, we ready to start?
Yep. Go ahead.
Well, welcome everybody to our presentation on abolishing the Electoral College. As was said, this is a critical issue for our country, and this presentation will give you all the reasons why the League of Women Voters supports a direct popular vote to elect our president and vice president. On the next slide, we're going to start by sharing the basics. What is the Electoral College, and what is the League of Women Voters' position on this method of electing our president? Next, we'll show the problems caused by the Electoral College, problems that a direct popular vote would easily solve. And then we'll review the top arguments given in favor of the Electoral College system and why each of those reasons are actually based on common myths.
It's recorded, that's good.
And then finally, we'll explain what needs to be done to abolish the Electoral College, which is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and what you can do now to help make that happen. And we'll do all of this and answer your questions at the end. So, on the next slide, pardon me if you know this all already, but we like to go through it because people's knowledge of the Electoral College really varies out there. First of all, of course, it is not a school or a building or a place. It's a group of 538 people who actually elect the president and vice president of the United States every 4 years. According to the U.S. Constitution, each state legislature gets to decide how their electors will be chosen. And in the beginning, state legislators just pick the electors themselves. Over time, though, states started choosing the electors by popular vote within their state. Each political party has their own slate of electors. So there is a slate of Republican electors, there's a slate of Democratic electors, and there's a slate of whatever other party is out there have their own electors. So when you vote in November, you're not voting directly for a presidential candidate, you're voting for a group of state electors from that candidate's political party who have pledged to give their votes to that candidate. Each state gets a specific number of electors, which is based on their congressional delegation. So one elector for each U.S. senator and each U.S. representative. For example, Texas in 2020 had 38 electoral votes, while Rhode Island had 4. The District of Columbia, although not a state, has been awarded 3 electors. So importantly, the winner of the Electoral College is not whoever gets the most electoral votes. The winner must have a majority of the votes, over 50% of the votes to win. So currently that means 270 electoral votes to win. Now, if no candidate gets 270 votes, for example, if there's a strong third party candidate or fourth party candidate, the US House of Representatives gets to choose the president. And this is important. In that kind of a contingent election, each state will have just one vote. So Minnesota will have one vote, Rhode Island will have one vote, California will have one vote. So in a contingent election, that's what happens. And then the Senate chooses the vice president. So what is the League's position? Well, since 1970, the beginning of 1970, the League's position has been that the direct popular vote method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. So the rest of this presentation will explain the many problems with the Electoral College that the League has identified. And you may have heard about some of them, but there are also some you may not have heard very much about. So what is wrong with the Electoral College, and how will a direct popular vote for president solve each and every one of them? That's our goal today. So to start, we're going to go back to the very beginning, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the long, hot summer of 1787. This was just after the American rebels had won independence from England, and the newborn country needed a national constitution to determine how it would be governed. So each of the original 13 states could send delegates to represent them at this convention. A total of 55 delegates attended. Some came and went, and they represented 12 of the 13 original states. So this included many famous men, including George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. All of these men, plus others, faced the task of creating a new national system of government for this new country. And there were a lot of fierce arguments and debates. How to elect a president was one of the first arguments to come up, and it was the last one to be resolved. And it was resolved through a compromise idea that ultimately came to be called the Electoral College. So, why was the Electoral College created? Well, one of the biggest reasons is slavery. The Electoral College was a compromise designed to give Southern states more voting power in presidential elections based on counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person. Now, you may have already heard about this 3/5 compromise that was used to increase the number of representatives given to Southern states in the US House of Representatives. And because the Electoral College is based in part on the number of members that each state has in Congress, it carried this infamous math into presidential elections. So this rift between the northern and southern states was not because there were more people living in the northern states than in the southern states. In fact, on this chart, you can see the 5 southern states and the 8 northern states divided in terms of their population in the late 1700s, and they were essentially equal, about 1.8 million people each. However, the southern states had a much smaller voting population than the northern states because over a third of the southern states had population was enslaved. So about a third, as you can see on the left there, that more bottom number that's in that, I never know what color that is, maroon, shows that it had a large chunk of enslaved people. So the southern states had a much smaller voting population than the northern states. As a result, the southern states adamantly refused a direct popular vote for president. So before the convention, everybody expected there would be battles between the smaller populated states and the larger population states. But you can see the quote on the right there, as Madison wrote about halfway through the convention, it seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lies not between the large and the small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. Now, if the racism of the Electoral College had ended when slavery ended, we might not even be having this section in this presentation. But the Electoral College continued to silence Black votes after the Civil War. So how did that happen? Well, first, the Electoral College ushered in the Jim Crow era. So right after the Civil War, there was a brief period called Reconstruction when federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce the newly won civil rights of the formerly enslaved Americans in the South. During Reconstruction, Black men, it was only men, voted, and the first Black representatives served in Congress. You can see a picture of them on the left. But then came the election of 1876, which was just a mess. I know we have messy elections now, but they had them back then too. So in 1876, records are a bit murky, but it's pretty clear that Sam Tilden actually won the popular vote for president over Rutherford B. Hayes. But there were allegations of voter fraud, sounds familiar, and in 4 states, Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon, both sides claimed victory. So as a result, Tilden did not get a majority in the Electoral College. So the two parties came up with a compromise that traded the newly awarded rights of Black people to shore up the malfunctioning Electoral College. And this compromise allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in exchange for removing the federal troops from the South. So the states of the former Confederacy were once again allowed to rule themselves, and they quickly started passing a series of laws commonly known as the Jim Crow laws. And during the Jim Crow era, the voting rights of Black people were systematically destroyed by state laws and local ordinances, things like poll taxes and literacy tests. The Jim Crow era lasted for almost 100 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Electoral College was created because of slavery, and the failure of the Electoral College in 1876 allowed racism to continue. Unfortunately, it didn't end there either. The Electoral College continues to suppress the voice of Black Americans. And that's because states with a higher percentage of Black residents tend to have less power in the Electoral College, while states with whiter populations tend to have more power. For this analysis, Electoral College power is defined as the number of people it takes within the state for each electoral vote. So I know it gets a little mathematical here, but follow with me. For example, in the chart on the left, in states that are more than 85% white, it's about 400,000 people per each electoral vote. But in states that are more than 15% Black, higher than the national average, it's almost 650,000 people per electoral vote. So that means that it takes 1.6 votes in states with high Black populations to equal 1 vote in states with higher white populations. Now, this is a very simplistic analysis based on the 2020 census data. A more sophisticated analysis was done by a gentleman called William Black from the University of Maryland in 2019, and he came to the same conclusion. His analysis of every election from 2000 on indicates the Electoral College has consistently awarded more votes per capita to states with whiter population. So I'm not saying the Electoral College is doing this on purpose, that it's trying to mute Black votes, but it is having that impact regardless, simply because of how our Black and white populations are distributed across the states. Now, perhaps this will reduce naturally over time, but maybe it would get even worse. A direct popular vote, though, would immediately eliminate this racist impact by making every voter count as 1 vote, regardless of race or any other demographic. So, a lot of people these days are not aware of the racism that's been part of the Electoral College from the beginning, yet they are aware of some of the other issues. So what do most people dislike about the Electoral College? The problem we hear most from people is that the Electoral College turns losers into winners, kind of like Rutherford B. Hayes, who we just talked about. 5 times in our history, the Electoral College has awarded the presidency to candidates who lost the popular vote. This was 3 times in the 1800s and twice in this century, in 2016 and in 2000. A direct popular vote for president would ensure that the candidate who gets the most votes from the population would actually become president. Another problem with the Electoral College is that it violates the principle of 1 person, 1 vote. It makes some votes count more than others, depending on where the voter happens to live. And that's because the number of electoral votes given to a state isn't exactly proportional to its population. No matter how many people live in a state, it gets 2 electoral votes based on its 2 senators. So voters from smaller states have their votes weighted more heavily than in the Electoral College than votes from larger states. So for example, you can see in the table on the left that 1 vote in Wyoming counts as much as almost 4 votes in Florida. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, or 1 electoral vote for every 192,000 people. Florida is a much bigger state than Wyoming, and it gets 1 electoral vote for every 743,000 people in Florida. So again, if you do some basic math, divide 743,000 by 192,000, in the Electoral College, it takes nearly 4 popular votes in Florida to equal 1 popular vote in Wyoming. And this plays out in other small versus large state matchups like Wyoming, Vermont, and Alaska. Smaller states whose electoral votes count as much as 3 or 4 votes in states like Florida, Texas, and California. Now, a fundamental principle of our country is that 1 person has 1 vote. It's the standard for every other election in this country, and it should be 1 person, 1 vote in our presidential elections. And that's exactly how it would be in a direct popular vote for president. Now, regardless of how votes are weighted in the Electoral College, we all know by now that only a few states really matter in the elections. These are the so-called swing states, where the outcome of the vote is considered to be up for grabs. The rest of the states are considered safe states, where the feeling is that the election result is obvious. So the map here shows the swing states from 2020. The top 6 swing states are in dark purple: Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. And then there were another 7 swing states in lighter purple. Now together, these 14 states got almost all the TV ads and campaign events. In fact, 100% of the TV ads and 98% of campaign events in the 2020 general election were in those states. They get all of the candidates' attention, more importantly, and even worse, it means they have greater influence over candidates' policy positions. The policies are designed to appeal to the swing states, not to the entire country. So with direct election by popular vote, again, candidates would be forced to pay attention to the whole country, not just a few swing states. All 50 states in the District of Columbia would require consideration from presidential candidates. And if that weren't bad enough, the Electoral College actually discourages voter participation. It gives people a reason not to vote. It actually decreases turnout in so-called safe states. Now, we looked at data from 2016 and 2020 to prove this. In the graphs, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in safe states compared to the swing states. These differences may seem small on this graph, only 6 or 7 percentage points, like what's the big deal? Those 6 or 7 percentage points translate to 15 million registered voters in non-swing states who chose not to vote in 2016, and even more, 22 million registered voters who did not vote in 2020. And that's more than enough to change the outcome of a presidential election. Now, this is a nonpartisan issue affecting both major political parties. If I'm a Republican voter in a so-called blue state or a Democratic voter in a so-called red state, I feel like my vote for president never counts anyway, so why bother? On the flip side, Republican voters in red states and Democratic voters in blue states feel like their party doesn't really need their vote. They're going to obviously win anyway, so millions of people just don't bother. So again, a direct popular vote would make sure that every vote counts and counts equally, and therefore should increase voter turnout. And this is the hard one, but it's the last one. As we saw in 2020 and afterwards, the Electoral College also leaves our presidential elections more vulnerable to manipulation and even outright fraud. The Electoral College provides partisan operatives with a roadmap for overturning election results. In 2020, that created a desire to find an additional 38 electoral votes instead of over 3.5 million votes if the winner were chosen by popular vote. And the Electoral College then drew a map to show where it would be easiest to gain these electoral votes. So it was by finding fewer than 43,000 ballots in just 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That's all it would have taken to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. So those are the 6 major problems with the Electoral College, and each of them would be fixed by using a direct popular vote for president. Now, you may be convinced by now, maybe you were convinced even before you logged on, but not everybody is. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rosemary, who is going to show you some of and basically bust the myths that people give in support of the Electoral College.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. After outlining all of these problems with the Electoral College, we still hear from some folks who say, well, even if this is true, here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. We'd like to walk through the most common reasons why some people continue to support the Electoral College system. These are not just fringe theories, by the way. These are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend this undemocratic system, and none of them stand up under scrutiny. They are actually myths that do not stand up to facts. So let's bust those myths now. The first one, Electoral College myth number 1. Without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California and New York. We decided to run through some numbers, so let me show you a little chart here, to see what a direct popular vote would actually look like. All right, well, these are the votes that were cast for Barack Obama in 2012. And we're assuming that 63.4 million votes were needed because that would be the halfway point. So if you look down here in little tiny letters along the bottom are the initials of all the states, and it starts with the most populous state, the one that cast the most votes on the left, which is California, and then the next biggest voter, New York and Florida and Texas, and then just going smaller and smaller and smaller all the way to Alaska at the end. And then each state, the number of voters for Obama is added on. So California, you can see, goes up to that little bar, and then you add New York's votes to the California bar, and that's where you get the second bar. So the first thing we noticed is that both Texas and Florida are larger than New York. All right, there we go. Popular votes. So we started with California. We added the Obama votes for each state. He had to get over 63 million votes to win the direct popular vote. And as you add them up, you will see that it took votes from 39 states to get him there, to get up to that bar. So that looks like it would be, maybe Maine or Arkansas there. And then the states, the little orange bars above the line, that was gravy. Those are extra. So that's a large majority of votes of states, not just a handful. It is mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states. The fact is that direct election by popular vote means that votes from most or all states would be needed to win the presidency, and every vote would count and count the same, no matter where the voter lives. And I veer off when I'm on this page because sometimes even that chart is a little hard for people to really focus on. And I got some statistics here from the official 2020 presidential general election results from the Federal Election Commission. And if you just have in your mind some of these numbers, it helps you understand why New York and California could not by themselves change the election. So in the 2020 election, there were 158 million votes cast. That's total votes cast. California cast 17.5 million. Now, it's a lot. It's one of the largest, it's the largest number, but 17 million is not going to change 158 million by itself. And then New York cast 8.5, say even 9. So you have 9 and 17, so you have 26 million votes. That's still a long way from changing an election in which 158 million votes were cast. So just by looking at those numbers, you can see that this is an illogical proposition. And the same, after seeing these facts about the states, believers in the Electoral College will bring up a similar myth, that without the Electoral College, our presidents would be chosen by just a few big cities, like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Once again, statistics tell a different story. These pie charts show the percentage of voting age adults who live in big cities. As seen on the first chart on the left, the combined voting age population of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago is just 5% of the national voting age population. That's certainly not enough to decide an election. So we expanded to the top 10 cities, those with over 1 million residents. And that adds up to just 8% of the voting age population. Even when
I think Rosemary froze.
that's
here.
about the same as the size of the rural population. There just aren't enough people living in big cities to decide our president on their own. Most people, 71% in this country, live in smaller towns and suburban areas. It is simply mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by the largest states or the largest cities. Once again, direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. Electoral College myth number 2. Abolishing the Electoral College would only benefit candidates from the Democratic Party. Well, to bust this myth, let's look at the 2004 presidential election, the Bush-Kerry election. On the left is the Electoral College map for the 2004 election, where George W. Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more popular votes than Kerry. The map on the right, however, shows how close George W. Bush came to winning the popular vote but losing the electoral vote. Can you spot the difference between the two maps? It's just one state, Ohio. If John Kerry had received only 119,000 more votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College and the election, even though Bush would still have had nearly 3 million more votes. That was a close call for the Republicans, and frankly, would have made our argument a lot easier because then we could say, well, it's happened to both parties, but it almost happened to the Republicans here. And there's nothing to say it couldn't happen in the future. The fact is, the Electoral College can hurt either of our two major political parties. This is a nonpartisan issue. And Joyce will cringe because I'm going to go off the script again here, because I want to talk about this map of the red and blue states. And this has done damage to our country because it has helped to polarize us, thinking that people from certain states have one belief and people from another state have another belief. If you look at the actual numbers of votes in this election, also from this Federal Election Commission, in California in 2020, 11 million people voted for Biden, but 6 million people voted for Trump. So that's a purple state. It's more bluish purple, but it's not all blue people. So it's more than half, more than 50% of the numbers of people voted for Trump. Well, 1/3 voted for Trump. And then let's look at Florida. So we think Florida was a true swing state. So it had roughly 3 million people voted for Biden, and 5.7 million people voted for Trump. So that was pretty close. Again, that is not a red state. That's a blue state, a purple state that's slightly reddish in its color. And even in a little tiny state like Montana. So in Montana, 245,000 people voted for Biden and 343,000 people voted for Trump. So if you go through all these numbers state by state by state, you'll be amazed that many of these red states, the Democrats won, maybe 40, 45, 49% of the votes, and the same thing in the blue states. There are a lot of red voters in these blue states. So this depiction of the states as red and blue has been harmful, we believe, to our country. All right. Myth number 4. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to eliminating the Electoral College is just plain pessimism. Many people feel that the Electoral College will never be abolished because it would take a constitutional amendment to do it. It's never going to happen is a comment we hear all too often. We need to defeat this defeatism. Here's a timeline showing the dates that all constitutional amendments were ratified. The Bill of Rights is shown with just one bar. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clumps, then another gap of 43 years. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and those of the 1950s and 60s. Then a gap of 21 years to the 27th Amendment in 1992. It's been 30 years since then. What distinguishes these periods of constitutional activity? They tended to be periods of great national political activity, where citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis, where the demand for change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the Progressive Era at the turn of the last century, and the Civil Rights Era in the 1950s and 60s. We seem to be in the middle of another period of political activity, of demand for change. Only time will tell, but the level of engagement that we are seeing now and the genuine concerns about the resiliency of our democracy are remarkable. So let's focus on our goal, abolishing the Electoral College by amending the Constitution. What will it take to get there? So we haven't mentioned the National Popular Vote Compact in this presentation up till now, but we know that Minnesota recently adopted the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and the League does support the compact until we get to an amendment. So it definitely is in the position that that is a step that is acceptable. It's not mandatory, but in any event, it's a step that we hope would be leading to an amendment, but we don't have to do that to get to amendment. Our ultimate goal is a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College and use a direct popular vote to elect our president. Now, this is what it would take. First, a bill to propose an amendment needs to pass both the House and the Senate by a 2/3 vote. That's not easy, nor should it be. Then the proposed amendment needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's 38 states. Again, not easy, but it has been done 27 times. We can do it again. Please note that it does not require, and the League doesn't support, a constitutional convention to accomplish this. The usual amendment process outlined here would do the job of abolishing the Electoral College. Now, actions that have happened in the past, in Congress took action between 1969 and 1970 to abolish the Electoral College. There was a ton of momentum at the time because in the 1968 election, a third-party candidate, George Wallace, got 46 votes in the Electoral College. Both Democrats and Republicans had been worried that Wallace's popularity could have resulted with neither Richard Nixon nor Hubert Humphrey, In Minnesota, I make that mistake. Oh my gosh. Hubert Humphrey getting the required 270 votes in the Electoral College to win the election. A Gallup poll at the time shows a whopping 81% of Americans supported abolishing the Electoral College. Now, nobody thought George Wallace was going to win, but George Wallace was hoping that he could have thrown the election into the House and then gotten some concessions from whoever was the leading candidate, Nixon or Humphrey, and he intended to play them off against each other. It didn't come to that, but people realized that it could happen, and that's why there was so much interest. A bill to amend the Constitution passed the House of Representatives by a huge bipartisan margin, 338 to 70. Even Nixon favored abolishing the Electoral College. However, the bill died in the Senate when it was filibustered by Southern Democrats, because remember, in those days, the Dixiecrats were the more conservative elements in the Congress. However, the bill died. It died in the Senate, where it was filibustered by Southern Democrats who feared that their states would lose power in presidential elections because of their traditionally low turnout. Similar bills have been introduced as recently as 2021, but there has been no vote on those bills. We believe this issue lacks momentum because of the defeatist attitude that it's never going to happen. So that's what we need to change. We need momentum. The League of Women Voters is uniquely positioned to empower voters through education and advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. This is what we do. We engage with voters, provide them with the information and education they need about elections and issues. And then, armed with this education, the League can activate voters to bring this momentum to Congress when the time is right. So we know that the time is not right now, but we do feel that the people want to know about this issue and become educated about this issue. So what can you do now? Well, there are several things. One is organizing, to educating, and then we hope to have some advocacy opportunities later on. As a local league, you can organize by choosing a league member to coordinate. Well, it's called a task force in the PowerPoint, but it's our committee basically. But we are happy to have people join our committee from any state, any league. They do not have to officially represent their league. A lot of our committee members are just interested league members who happen to come from different states and different committees. They may not be representing their particular league. We meet on the third Fridays of each month at noon Central Time on Zoom, and we're very happy to have as many people join us. And we've had members from all over the country that have helped put together this PowerPoint presentation, who gave input into the state brochure the national brochure that they use. So it's been a wonderful experience to work with people from all over the country. You can also start to identify local or state allies, community leaders, activists, and legislators who support a direct popular vote for president. And please maintain a contact list for action alerts about the Electoral College when LWV does issue the action alerts. The number one most important thing you can do is educate. Educate yourself, educate others. Our committee will be offering Electoral College 101 training for league members and allies. Actually, we had a training last month. It was pretty exciting. We had a meeting like this, and we divided into breakout rooms with the people that were wanting to be trained, and we had mentors. So we had 8 trainees who were divided into 5 groups, trained Pennsylvania. We trained more people from Michigan and some from Illinois to give the presentation. And they each had 2 mentors in their group to help them go through the presentation and answer questions. And we never send anyone out all by themselves. You know, we always have someone go with you, you know, and make sure that you know what you're doing. And this is, if you may not have guessed already, this is a scripted presentation. So this script makes it easy for somebody to give the presentation, and we have some ways to get some additional training if desired. So we're offering this training. If you'd like to learn more, we'd be happy to help you. And then reach out to your local civic and social groups, colleges, universities, anywhere there are people who are willing to listen and learn. And you can distribute our brochures whenever you can. I send a PDF to your leaders there, and you can purchase them or you can print them yourself. Finally, momentum requires visibility. Let everyone know that the full power of the League of Women Voters is fueling the efforts to abolish the Electoral College and elect our president and vice president by direct popular vote. We're happy to announce that this national campaign, we noticed if you did your US program planning, is now the 5th pillar in the campaign for making democracy work. So we are very excited about that, and we look forward to working with anyone who's interested, and of course, continuing to work with LWV of the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosemary and Jane. It's a wonderful educational piece. Thank you so much. And also for the suggestions of things that we can do, we as individuals or as the league or interested people. And I know there are some people online today that are not league members, but they can still learn and share and so forth. So that's just great. Julie, are there any questions in the chat?